Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is about such an unbelievable story. It is honestly so crazy what these people went through, and the fact that they have survived this, it's unbelievable. Today's video is about the story of Yossi Ginsberg, who was lost in the Amazonian jungle with no supplies, no food, no water, no communication with the outside world for 3 entire weeks. The story is about how he managed to survive this ordeal. Yossi Ginsberg was born on the 25th of April, 1959 in Tel Aviv, Israel. His parents were both Holocaust survivors. When he turned 18, Yossi joined the Israeli Navy. He served for 3 years in the Red Sea before his adventures started. In November of 1981, Yossi Ginsberg was 22 years old and fresh out of the army. He described himself as being very naive, bright-eyed, and happy-go-lucky at this time of his life and craved adventure and travel. He had been absolutely amazed by the idea of visiting a rainforest. He started working immediately to save enough money to do exactly that. At first, he worked as a construction worker in Norway and thereafter as a fisherman in Alaska. He actually managed to save quite a bit of money from these jobs, but unfortunately lost everything he had earned during a wild night at a Las Vegas casino. After working at his uncle's record shipping business in New York, he had managed to save all the money all over again. He traveled to South America to finally live out his dream. Yossi was very drawn to the book Papillon by Henry Carrier. He writes about his experience as a convict on the run from authorities, hiding in jungles and at sea for a 14-year span. The writer writing about these experiences was notably running from the authorities and hiding, as he continued to be in and out of multiple prisons. Yossi's plan was to thus visit a rainforest and meet the author himself while in South America. Unfortunately, by the time Yossi did finally manage to travel to South America, the author had already passed away. The same tribes that the author had lived with that Yossi so badly wanted to meet had also at this point long been integrated into society. This did not deter Yossi, who very much still had that craving for adventure. During his time in Colombia, he had made a friend, 29-year-old Marcus Stum, who was a Swiss teacher and explorer. Yossi had met Marcus on a ferry when Marcus had actually missed the ferry, but the captain had turned around and fetched him. The butterfly effect was in full swing at this moment, because if the captain had never turned around to fetch Marcus, his life could have turned out extraordinarily different. Marcus convinced Yossi to join him on a trip to Bolivia, a country more south in the continent, to which Yossi agreed. Yossi described Marcus as a very friendly person who had a big heart and was very kind. Yossi even tells of an incident where him and Marcus were on a bus together and someone had grabbed and stolen the large expensive camera of a French birdwatcher straight off his shoulder. The man was absolutely inconsolable, which led to Marcus giving the man his own camera. This story illustrates just how kind of a personality Marcus Stum had. After meeting Marcus, Yossi had met Kevin Gale in Bolivia, who was a 29-year-old photographer and traveler from Oregon. Finally, Yossi met the shady Austrian geologist Karl Ruprechter. Yossi said that the man had approached him in the streets and tried to get acquainted with him, saying that he had been in South America for over 15 years. Yossi was feeling low as he still had not achieved his dream and didn't feel much like speaking to the man. He tried every possible way to shake him off. Suddenly though, Karl started speaking about forests, his expertise in the jungle, and tribes, and Yossi's attention was immediately caught. Karl spoke of an untouched tribe, completely isolated from society, known as the Toromona tribe. He also spoke about lost treasure and gold in the jungle in a very remote part of the Amazon. This part of the Amazon was completely uncharted, but Karl spoke about how he was planning an expedition in search of the golden treasure there. Karl was such a good storyteller that Yossi could practically relate his dreams word for word with the man's stories. In hindsight, Yossi says that he believed the man sensed the young 22-year-old's naivety and how he was taking in every word the man spoke like an excited child. This led to Yossi wholeheartedly begging Cole to let him join him on his mission. Not that Yossi probably even had to beg, because it had been Cole's intention all along to drag the young man with him. Yossi met up with his two friends, Marcus and Kevin, that he had formerly met only a few days before, and convinced them to join him after telling them the wild stories that Cole had told him. It took quite a bit of convincing and begging the two men, trying to remind them that this was an opportunity of a lifetime. The two men finally agreed, and the group of four set off for the adventure. Later on, it was revealed by Kevin that he did only join Yossi to try to capture some great photographs with the possibility of them being published by National Geographic, though Kevin later admits that was only partially the reason for joining Yossi. He otherwise wanted to join to experience this opportunity for himself. The four started out in La Paz after flying there by plane. From La Paz, they traveled to the Tuichi River, which is near a village named Asariamas. The trip was still very much pleasant at this point, as the men enjoyed their time getting to know the villagers while restocking on food and supplies. Thereafter, the men would head off in search of treasures and uncontacted tribes. By now, the red flags should have been clear, as the settlers in the area warned the men not to do this. However, they obviously continued on. Cole had sat the men down with a map and explained how they would travel into the deep forest by crossing the Tuichi River. He would follow his finger along a line that he himself drew across the map in an uncharted and unknown territory of that part of the forest. He said that that line would be their 4-day hike, and then they would finally reach an X he had marked on the map. This X supposedly signified the uncontacted tribe in the Amazon. The men had believed Cole's explanation and map, possibly due to the charisma and confidence that he had exuded. The plan was that after they meet the uncontacted tribe, Cole said that they would return back to civilization by traveling down the Tuichi River on a raft that they would build. He spoke about it as if it would be a brisk walk in the park. On the first day since leaving the Asariamas village, the men had already started feeling some uneasiness about the whole trip. They were fully aware that they were now abandoning any civilization and contact that they would have with the outside world. They were also entering dangerous parts of the jungle, as they didn't actually have any idea where they were going. The men tried to keep their minds occupied while walking by admiring the deep jungle. It was filled with interesting animals and sounds, and everything that was happening around them was amazing. It was described as a breathtaking experience, and many photographs were taken by Kevin Gale. Cole reassured the men that they would not have to take that much food on the trip with them, because they would just simply hunt for their food in the forest, which was apparently loaded with resources for the men to survive off of. The only things the men were carrying on them were rice, beans, and salt. By the third day, the men were still hiking strong and still trusting their guide. However, this wouldn't last too long, as tensions were already forming. Although they were able to hunt for food, it wasn't exactly pleasant food. Cole managed to hunt a large monkey to prepare for dinner for the men that evening. Marcus, between all the men, was the most appalled by the monkey. He couldn't bring himself to eat it, or even force himself to eat it, and simply skipped the meal. This caused the tensions to just further rise, as the men couldn't understand why Marcus refused to eat the food that they could find in an environment like that. They would simply brush him off as overly sensitive and continue with their journey. By the 8th day of straight hiking, the men started becoming frustrated. Conversations surrounding Cole and the three friends questioning his knowledge were common. They started to become suspicious of this guide who, earlier on, seemed so confident and trustworthy. Marcus started developing a condition known as trench foot. This occurs when one's feet are wet for an extended period of time. Feet become red or blue in color and often develop painful infections. They would even start to swell up and start to smell of decay. The amount of walking and stepping through wet rivers and wet mud only worsened Marcus's condition. Marcus would constantly complain about how painful this was, understandably, and struggle to keep up with the group. The animosity towards Marcus only grew from there, as the other men had felt he was constantly complaining and struggled to sympathize with him and believe him about the excruciating pain. This is when Cole brought up a plan and started devising it, where Cole and one other man would try to head back to the village and find civilization, and the third would stay behind with Marcus. This was met with anger and questioning, as the men were frustrated that Cole had lied to them. The hike was now already up to 8 days, whereas he had promised 4 days. Kevin then suggested a different idea. He thought that they could build a raft and Marcus could sail it downriver in order to take some strain off his feet. This was ultimately when the dream of meeting an uncontacted tribe came to an end. The group slowly hiked towards the Tuichi River, and possibly the most upset of them all was Kevin Gale. He was upset and angry that he would never meet the uncontacted tribe and fulfill this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He later on admitted that he was not in a good mindset or in a good mood on the return trip. Once again, blame was shifted to Marcus. The explorers thought it was all over and that they would return back to civilization without much to tell about the expedition. They didn't, however, fully realize the extent of the situation and that returning would not be easy at all. Once the men would reach the Tuichi River, they didn't anticipate that the raft all the way back to civilization spans over 100 miles or 161 kilometers. On the 12th day, the men finally reached the Tuichi River and started building their raft. At this point, they were not fully aware of how dangerous the situation would still become. Kevin Gale finally snapped on the raft and lost all respect he had towards Cole as the authority figure. This happened when Kevin noticed that Cole had absolutely no ability to maneuver his paddle with the raft and also had no idea how to swim. This is especially questionable for someone who claimed to have over 15 years experience in the jungle, where rivers form a very large part of the space. A fight broke out on the raft while they were sailing down the river over who was worse at rowing between Cole and Kevin. The frustration and the arguing led to the men just sailing the raft back to the shore, and they were once again on the land and stuck. Cole immediately suggested that this raft plan should be completely abandoned. He once again decided that the journey should rather be taken on foot. Cole explained that 1 mile further down the river leads to a canyon, and after passing the canyon, there would be no way to reach shore for miles on end. He then suggested that they would walk down around the canyon and that they would reach a small village a few miles away from the river. Everyone but Kevin agreed to Cole's suggestion. This is because Kevin desperately wanted to raft down the river and just for one last time experience a little bit more of the Amazon forest. Kevin did finally somehow manage to convince Yossi to join him on the river, but to leave Marcus out of this rafting experience. The group, on the bank of the Tuichi River, ultimately decided to split up and say their goodbyes. Cole and Marcus would travel on foot back to civilization, while Yossi and Kevin would raft back down the river, despite the warnings that Cole had given them. Yossi later revealed how terrible it felt for him for the two groups to be splitting up on those terms, especially if he had known that that would be the last time the two groups would ever see one another again. It was later on estimated, according to the location, that it would take Cole and Marcus about a week to hike back to the nearest village. Meanwhile, Yossi and Kevin had constructed their raft and were now on the river by themselves. At that moment, their spirits were high as they set off in what they considered a new adventure. They could feel the excitement in the air, despite the circumstances. Yossi had now given the responsibility over to Kevin, as he had deemed him more knowledgeable in this situation. The excitement that they had was very short-lived. The river became more rapid as the men sailed on. Referring back to Carl's earlier warnings about the dangers of this river, the men now found themselves in that exact predicament. The raft had crashed into a large rock in the middle of the river, and Kevin and Yossi were now stuck at that point. After some deliberation, Kevin decided that he would jump off the rock and swim across the river, and then he would throw Yossi a line to cross after him. Unfortunately, as soon as Kevin had reached the shore, the raft stuck on the rock had become unstuck and swept Yossi down the river. Yossi was pulled under the rapids and further separated from Kevin. During this time, he was also being flung against rocks and trees. Yossi later on described this experience as terrifying and nearly drowned in the ordeal. He was finally swept to shore after a long time in the water and had absolutely no idea where he was. By now, it was getting dark and cold, and the two men, approximately 2 miles apart from one another, decided to sleep in the jungle after an exhausting day. The following morning, Kevin and Yossi started looking for one another, where Kevin was traveling downstream and Yossi would travel back up to the canyon where they were separated. By a miracle chance, Yossi had found the two men's supply backpack floating in a pooled section of the river near the bank. He was now equipped with a torch, rain cover, a map, and some rice. A full day went by with no luck of the men finding one another, despite now being a mile closer to one another. This is when Kevin decided to move away from the riverbank and hike straight into the jungle. This was a crucial mistake, as Yossi was moving straight towards him along the riverbank. Days now go by, with Yossi and Kevin just moving further away from one another and running lower and lower on food, supplies, and energy. If Kevin had just stuck to the riverbank, or at least stayed where he was, him and Yossi would have more than likely found one another after a few days. Unable to sleep properly in the jungle, Yossi describes the environment around him. He couldn't fall asleep because of how every single sound in the darkness scared him, and how truly loud the jungle is, with the sounds of insects, animals, plants, and trees rustling all around him. One night, Yossi heard a low growl in the dark. He grabbed the torch to immediately investigate, and as soon as he flicked the light on, the torch shone straight into the face of a jaguar. Frozen into a stare-off with the animal, Yossi reaches into his coat for a lighter and into his bag for insect repellent. He explained that he had seen in a movie how aerosols could be lit and sprayed and used as a weapon. This is exactly what Yossi did, and successfully scared off the jaguar with the blazing flame. This didn't calm Yossi down though, who sat in fear for the rest of the night, afraid of what might happen next. The following day, he was exhausted, but still walking. However, he believed that Kevin was dead. Yossi, who was now miles further into the jungle than he had originally been, sat down and consulted the map. He remembered something about a close-by camp that Carl had spoken about, and started heading in that general direction, by now fully delusional and exhausted. He walked along a supposed trail he thought he could pick up from marks made in the trees. Hours passed when Yossi finally spotted a footprint in the mud, believing it to be Kevin's. He rushed to a nearby tree where he spotted another marking and turned around. The footprint he saw was his own, made hours before. Yossi had walked in a full circle. 4 days, while Yossi is still walking to the supposed camp Carl spoke of, and to follow the river thereafter, he survived off rotten fruits he could find on the jungle floor. By this time, his supplies were already completely finished. He followed the riverbank now and came to the mining camp, sitting down to rest. He tended to his own painful case of trench foot now, which had also actually spread to his hands, and he felt extremely guilty about the way he had treated Marcus. He had wondered if this was possibly karma. That evening, on the wet ground and only covered by the rain cover, Yossi tried to sleep in a loud and heavy storm. A massive flood had washed over Yossi and started dragging him to the river away from the camp. Once again, he was being swept under the heavy currents, and this time in the dark night. He awoke the next morning, half submerged in a puddle and far away from the riverbank. He got up once again and started walking to find the river. Kevin, now back along the riverbank again and miles away from Yossi, had been without food and supplies for 5 days now. On the verge of collapsing and absolutely having no energy to walk, Kevin braves the river currents again. Holding onto a buoyant tree trunk and floating down the river, the only hope Kevin had at this point was that this trunk would carry him downriver back to civilization. In San Jose, for hours, barely conscious, Kevin Gale had floated down the river. He heard faint voices and opened his eyes to see a canoe with 2 men inside, and managed to get their attention. After swimming towards the canoe, the men lifted Kevin Gale inside and immediately started asking questions. He was given food and told that those 2 men only hunted in that area twice a year, which makes him being found even more miraculous. Kevin, meanwhile, is however only thinking about where Yossi could possibly be. A few days after Kevin's rescue, when at this point it is estimated Yossi was walking back to the riverbank after being swept away from the flood, Kevin approaches a Bolivian army airbase. He tried to convince them to organize a search for Yossi, but the generals simply told Kevin to give up on him and go back to the United States. They believed that Yossi was already dead and told Kevin this. Kevin continued to refuse and eventually is given his helicopter and search mission. On the ground, Yossi does in fact spot this helicopter flying above him, but is unable to get its attention. He would then again go completely unsaved. Frustrated, Yossi collapses on the ground in defeat, which is said to be the same way Kevin had felt after the failed rescue mission. Days pass as Yossi, weak with starvation and hallucinations, continues trekking through the jungle. At one point, he had even hallucinated a woman being with him. On top of the hallucinations, Yossi had also attempted to climb a nearby tree in order to try get fruit he had spotted, but was almost bitten by a venomous snake. He would fall to the ground, grab a rock, and climb straight back on the tree. He said that he had beaten the snake and eaten it. Kevin still hasn't given up at this point and approached a local fisherman as a last resort. He had asked to borrow his boat to search for Yossi. Miles away again, that evening, Yossi is bitten by fire ants while he's trying to sleep. He would be bitten hundreds of times and would realize he was absolutely covered in them. He would frantically try to escape from what he termed a red carpet of ants all around him and on him. That's when he tried to crawl away. The next morning, Kevin and the fishermen are sailing with the small motorized boat up the river and looking along the shores. Yossi, meanwhile, is still crawling and reaches a clearing. This was the camp that he originally had reached before being swept away from the river, and Yossi had promptly collapsed, unable to walk anymore due to his infections, bites, starvation, and exhaustion. Yossi's wounds were not healing due to all the moisture in the air, and he had finally given in to the Amazon. Days later, Kevin and the fishermen are out on one last final mission to find Yossi. It has now been over a month since the men had started out the journey with Carl, and it had now been over 3 weeks since Yossi was last seen. Kevin and the fishermen reach a far point before the fisherman tells Kevin that they have to turn back. He said this as the river turns into rapids only further up. Defeated, Kevin agrees and heavily accepts that he will probably never see Yossi again. They sail back down towards civilization. Yossi, asleep on the riverbank where he had collapsed, hears a buzzing. He looks up and notices the small boat sailing by. He waves, and Kevin, still scanning the banks, spots Yossi at the exact last moment that he would have been completely out of view. It was an emotional reunion. Yossi was immediately transported back to the village and taken to a hospital. He was extremely grateful to Kevin for saving his life. For a total of 20 days, Yossi Ginsberg was lost in the Amazon rainforest. He had lost 12 kilograms or 26 pounds during this ordeal. He would spend a full 3 months in hospital undergoing care. Days after being rescued, while still recovering, Yossi would ask about Marcus and Carl. They were still missing. At this point, Kevin was still looking for them and trying to find them, but had no luck. Soon, information about the geologist Carl started to surface. The Bolivian army traveled into the jungle in search of the remaining 2 men, and they would use Carl's map as a reference. The X, marked as this uncontacted tribe, never existed. Kevin and Yossi were soon told about Carl's history of taking naive travelers into the forest under the same pretenses and leaving them. It soon became known that Carl was not in fact a geologist or a jungle expert, and was in fact a wanted conman and criminal. Kevin and Yossi had spent years organizing searches for Marcus Stum, but they had sadly never again found any trace of him. The Amazon rainforest area is, shockingly, as large as Australia. Almost half of every single species that exists on this planet can be found in the Amazon rainforest. The story of Yossi and how him and Kevin were ever found seems completely unbelievable despite the circumstances. Today, Kevin lives in Israel with his family and works as a fitness instructor and photographer. Yossi Ginsberg lives in Australia and is a motivational speaker, and is also known for his many efforts in conservation, especially his work in the Amazon jungle. Released in 2017 is a film called Jungle, starring Daniel Radcliffe as Yossi Ginsberg. All the details of the full story are included in this film because it was adapted straight from Ginsberg's book, known as Jungle, a harrowing story of survival. The story is also reenacted by a very well selected cast. I highly recommend watching this film if you're more interested in a visual story about these events, and if you would like to find out more about this unbelievable tale of survival. That's the video for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment down below if you have any suggestions of content that you would like to see me film next.